Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. I'm Steve, and please don't forget to do those YouTubey things. You know exactly what they are. They help the algorithms. They'll help me, the channel, the community grow, and obviously that is very much appreciated. In today's video, we will start this series that is based upon a series of articles which really just is an in-depth analysis of each position in regards to fantasy football. And the data that I used is the data from 2021. In the future, after next season, I will be able to put 2022 data in there and really help to complete and, well, maybe not complete, but build the information to an even more accurate, better level than just being based on one season's worth of data. The primary goal of this analysis is really just comes down to draft relevancy. I wanted to see a lot of things in terms of value as well as just pure fantasy point output. There are some theories that I have that maybe go a little bit differently than to how the industry has treated certain things or how they analyze certain things. So ultimately, I just wanted to paint a draft profile for each position within sometimes maybe a little bit different boundaries than we typically think of. And also just to find out interesting nuggets about each of the positions and how they operate and really where the positions of, or the spots of value within a position. That said, all the articles, at least at this point, are free on the website. There will be some things which I will point out specifically in videos that matter that are going to be only for the Patreons, but there's more about that on the Patreon page, which is down in the description. Obviously, patronage is very much appreciated, but I do view all of you as supporters. If you have the ability to and are willing to help out in the monetary sense, of course, extremely appreciated. I need to eat. I need to keep the lights on. I want to be able to continue to do this for you. So, love you all, including those who are patrons. As far as where you can find those articles, there is also going to be a website link down in the description, and that is going to bring you to theFFforge.com, short for thefantasyfootballforge.com. Now, speaking of the series of videos, in each of the videos, I will basically go through three primary pieces of framework that I'm sticking with it. I'll begin by talking about some of the baseline data and some of the expectations that you should have for the position. And then I will go into how much of that baseline data can be translated into draft relevant information. Just knowing what the ceiling is of the quarterback one in any given week is it's a tough thing to translate to, anything that you can bring into the draft as far as helping you be a better drafter. And then finally, and throughout the entirety of the process, but most of it will come at the end, there will be interesting nuggets and conclusions that I came to about each of the positions that I cover. So I think it's time to just get into today's topic. Obviously, quarterbacks by the title of the video. Don't know what that'll be yet, but just a little baseline guidance for today's video. The scoring system that all of the data is based upon is going to be 4 point per passing touchdown leagues instead of like a 6 point, and 1 point per 25 passing yards scoring. Along with that, everything is based on a 12-team league, so just keep those three things in mind. If your league has different scoring, adjust accordingly where appropriate. I think it's pretty obvious usually where it would be appropriate to make adjustments. For instance, my primary league that I am in is a 1 point per 20 passing yards. So if there is a pure passer like a Tom Brady who's neck and neck with a Jalen Hurts in my draft, even if I have Jalen Hurts above, I might be giving the edge to a pure passer like Tom Brady just because there is that extra point for every 100 yards total that is available in those leagues going to the guys who are throwing for more yards than a Jalen Hurts type passer so far in his career. But without further ado, let's use a cheesy transition and get into this. Alrighty then. Let's begin this analysis where my analysis began, which was the results of that are right here in chart 1. And this is the results of tracking each week's fantasy points at the quarterback 1, 6, 12, etc. from the 2021 season. The main idea that there aren't necessarily exactly 12 quarterback ones is at the heart of where really all of this began. Wanting to look into the fact that I feel like the industry has kind of maybe not put itself in a corner, but kind of stuck to this idea that there needs to be like 12 QB1s if it's a 12 team league and 12 quarterback 2s. Why would that be the case? I mean, there could be more or less players that average roughly the same thing. Just because one player averages like 0.2 points different across the entirety of a season, I don't think necessarily makes them worse than or better than the other individual. So along with that, I feel like just having a QB1 doesn't necessarily give you an advantage. And I feel like a lot of analysts kind of like, oh, that's the goal, is to get a QB1, an RB1. Shouldn't the goal to be maybe to get like a QB6, top 6, or top 6 for running back to truly give you an advantage against the others that you are expecting to be seen on a week in and week out basis? Of course, every week we know things are all over the board. It's football. It's craziness. What can you do about that? But that's part of this analysis, to find out how often that's happening, at what positions, how predictable positions are, in essence. So if you stick to the construct of there being 12 quarterback ones, then you should want 6 of the best of that group, in my opinion. So in this data here, we are seeing the averages, the ceilings, the floors, high and low right there. Standard deviations tracked a lot of different things of the position. For the purposes of this video, we'll just start by looking at the floors, the lows, and the ceilings for the quarterback 1. About 27 points to 43 points is the floor to ceiling, top to bottom, for the quarterback 1 of any given week. And for the quarterback 6, it would be about 18.5 to 27.5 points. For the quarterback 12, we're looking at 14.5 to 22 points for the ceiling. And for the quarterback 18, about 10.5 to 18.5 points. We're going to stick to the top 18 for as much of this analysis as possible, as, well, I think it'll be clear enough. Also, if you are watching me down here in the corner of the screen, I'm sorry, there is going to be a bit of an annoying sound delay going on. It's not your imagination, that's really how it is. It's just how I have to record this, well, how I know how to at this point in learning everything here. So deal with it. Don't watch me. Look at the stuff on the screen anyways. That's why it's there. Moving on to, we're going to get to those averages here. What are the, I think it's a better idea. You get a better idea of the positions by looking at the averages. Well, the quarterback 1 averages about 33.5 points. Quarterback 6 right there, 23.5. Quarterback 12, 18-ish. And the quarterback 18, about 14. Now that's great too. And as I stated in the intro, these bits of information, they sound great, but how do you really take that on draft day and say, well, I need a quarterback 1 because they average so many points? Well, they don't score at the number one quarterback on the year doesn't score as the number one quarterback every single week. How often do they do that? These are the types of questions that are answered in the analysis. But personally, when it comes to that type of thing, I like to look at expected ranges. Better than a coin flip type of odds, or coin flip type of odds dependent upon exactly how accurate some of these ranges are. But I can tell you pretty much so far, I've done all the positions except for one, and it's always right around where it is supposed to be, around that 50% chance that they end up in those, in that range of outcomes. And it's a hard cutoff. I know I've seen where a guy will miss the cutoff by, a tenth of a point or something. So these do a pretty good job of giving you a good idea of the fact that the quarterback one on any given week is probably going to score between 30.5 to about 36 fantasy points. You can expect that the quarterback 6 is going to give you about 22 to 25 points on the week. And here's where we get to see some of the value that you lose as the position goes down. How quickly is that value being lost? Right here, this 29%, negative 29% that I have highlighted, is the percentage relative change in points from the quarterback 1 to the quarterback 6, just like this negative 23 would be from the quarterback 6 to the quarterback 12. And that is going to bring us to page 4. So I had to see where. And my pages might be off. But that brings us to one of the things that I really liked in this analysis that I came up with out of it was what I called Value Mountain. Now, Value Mountain is just like all of this analysis does. We're taking some of that data that we just went over, that relative change, and we're taking it one step further to look more closely at something that we can take away from the position. And here we see that the quarterback 1 gives you a 23% advantage over the quarterback 6. He's up on a hill. There's nobody that's going to give you a better advantage, and he gives you an advantage over the next in a value specific mountain way. So this does make more sense if you go through the analysis, but just running through it here, the quarterback 1 is on a hill with a 23% positive on a hill. Quarterback 6 is in a valley with sloped sides of negative 23% and negative 4%. And that's why it's in a valley, because it's not more valuable than the quarterback 12. The quarterback 12 is on a hill because it is more valuable than both the quarterback 6 and the quarterback 18 by 4% and 6% respectively. Quarterback 18 is in a valley with slope sides of negative 6 and negative 80%, and the quarterback 24 is on a hill with slope sides of 80%. Now, if we're going to stick to things that really matter, we don't need to look down to that quarterback 30 as far as season-long type outcomes are concerned, because nobody averages being the quarterback 30. So you're not expecting anybody to give you those really, really terrible weeks, the bottom of the roster or the bottom of the position type of weeks in any given week. And that also means that of the quarterbacks that are at the QB 24, as far as averaging in a week, and we'll get to that in just a second, you can't really predict them. They're unpredictable. It's not a relevant thing to say that they are 80% more valuable than anybody, because there's nobody that they're 80% more valuable than compared to quarterback 18. And I'll show you an example on exactly what I'm saying, because don't get confused. Just because the quarterback 18 is 80% less valuable than a QB 24, that doesn't mean that they're scoring fewer points. Remember, these are based on relative percentages to the next worst quarterback that I kept track of. So let's look at that example, which is going to be on page 13-ish. Right down here, where I want you to pretend that you are in a league where you have 2 opponents every week for the purposes of this example. And in any given week, you happen to have the QB 24, the quarterback who had the 24 most points on the week. And I took a random week from 2021 from this example, which was week 3 in 2021, which means that Ben Roethlisberger is your quarterback in this example, who scored 13.22 fantasy points in that week. Now, your opponents happen to have the quarterback 18 and the quarterback 30. Remember of this? That means that the quarterback 24 should be the most valuable in this grouping. Baker Mayfield was the quarterback 18. He scored 16.94 points in week 3 of 2021, and Trevor Lawrence, the QB 30 that week, scored 7.46 fantasy points, a bad week, which means that your QB 24 ended up with a net positive of roughly 2 points, because if you look down here, it is plus 5.76 points over Trevor Lawrence, where you were negative 3.72 points behind Baker Mayfield. That is what this means by being more and less valuable. It doesn't mean more fantasy points. It means means you're in a net positive area. Now, does this example, is it going to work out like that every single week at every position? No, I mean, this was like the biggest percentage difference, and you can see it's like 2 points. Oh boy. So all of that information is, it's good and dandy to know, but how does that actually impact how I draft? That's the question here. Well, I use all of these kinds of patterns and trends and observations that I'm making through these first 17, 18 pages here, and cloistering, literally that's what I will call them, is cloisters as we get down here, that information to create groups of like outcomes. So for instance, we have cloister 1 is quarterback 1, 2, 3, and 4. I did do subcloisters, but in the, if you're looking at the overall outcomes of things, the subcloisters don't really matter. That's just if you really want to dig into, look at maybe some specific things if you're creating your own kinds of draft guide that would help you with that. So the quarterback 1 and 2 average 1, 2, 3, and 4 really 30 plus fantasy points, give or take. And then the cloister 2 would be the quarterback 5 through the quarterback 11 in any given week, which is an area that you would expect 20 plus fantasy points. The next step after that was to place sets of individual players within these cloisters, because these aren't individual players, these are the outcomes of any given week, of every single week, every quarterback 10, every quarterback 11, in the case of the lower portion of the second cloister for the quarterbacks. So, how we did that will bring us to an equalized value chart, which I did not preload, which is here. So this is how we figured out where to place the players within the chart. On here, you are looking at, I don't know where to begin. In this middle part is where I began. So what I do is I collected as you're seeing right here, the fantasy points scored by each of the players every single week. You might be able to hear my cat eating in the background. And what I did is I essentially smoothed out the value of those point outcomes by normalizing that data and figuring out if a quarterback scores within plus or minus 1 standard deviation of the average of, for instance, the quarterback 1, then they would get that purple coloring, which then I later went in and I awarded them 36 points for that. Now, this really rewards consistency. I did not totally ignore boom or bust because I did want this to be something very tangible to be able to turn right into rankings in essence when creating it. And so anything that scored above 1.5 standard deviations would have been awarded 39 points. You'll see the points over here awarded go down by 3 at every half step, and every full step between the quarterback 1 to the quarterback 6 was 6 points. I could have done a sliding scale to reward more points for, having a better week, but that's not really what I was searching to figure out. I think you can just look at average fantasy points if you want a sliding scale type situation. So above 1.5 points, they got awarded standard deviations. They got awarded 39 points, and above 2 standard deviations, they would have gotten awarded 42 points, and no more. They could have scored 7 standard deviations above the average quarterback 1, what qualifies to be the quarterback 1 of any given week on average, and it wouldn't have made a difference compared to someone who just scored 2 standard deviations. So that could have somebody scoring 45 points and somebody scoring 100 points. In the end, they're getting 42 points on here, on my scale for the equalized value. Now, you take all 17 weeks, whatever, you divide the amount of weeks that they earned any points, divide that by the total amount of weeks, by the total score, other way around though, and you get the equalized value, the score that is over here. Those colors then can be essentially reverse engineered and coordinated back to, for instance, Josh Johnson, who does get erased from much of the data, and Kyler Murray are considered to be quarterback 9s. Now, anybody who lands in the in-between of a quarterback 6, quarterback 12 on average, it might technically be a quarterback 10 or quarterback 8. But that's just how it works out here. I call them quarterback 9s if they land in a specific area. I think, so to finish that up, then we know that where they fit in the cloister. So they averaged the quarterback 9, for instance, here. So you can see that lands them in cloister 2. If we go up a little bit, cloister 2 would have been quarterbacks 5 through 11. So we put them in cloister 2, and there were 3 quarterbacks in there. Do a lot of analysis on different things. Like I said, by the time we so the next step then will be to turn these into tiers. Let me make sure I'm not missing out on anything I wanted to talk about there. Correct. We're on pace here. So then we turn those into tiers because, as you see, cloister 1 doesn't have anybody that landed in there. And that can happen at different points. I think one of the positions doesn't have like a cloister 4. So those tiers represent, in this instance, what I wanted to just point out was I also got rid of quarterbacks who didn't play in more than 5 games on the season. Did that for every position just to get, a more consistent data set to work with, because if a player plays for 1 week and averages, we'll see it in the kickers, like averages as the best kicker along the season, that's not really a good sample size to work from for 1 week of results. So the other thing that I wanted to mention about the tiers is what we have done here is we have wiped away all of the individual identity of those that are within the cloisters. The quarterbacks 12s and 15s, for instance, are now cloister 2. There's no individuality anymore once we have turned them into the tiers. What we have created is essentially a crystal ball that we can use to project forward, a blank slate to write and imprint all of this information onto based on the results of the data. And then we can turn that into draft tiers. So, where are we? Well, I'll give you a couple examples. For instance, how many players do I expect to finish the 2022 season within each tier? Well, I would expect there to be 2 quarterbacks that are every week starters at least, or on draft day, that you could expect to get who would have an advantage, who would give you a tangible, noticeable advantage across the season versus every other quarterback. And who knows, 2022 data might give me another quarterback takeaway. I know, looking in here, I wasn't sure if it'd be 1 to 4 quarterbacks that might qualify for that. You know, it doesn't take much to change a season when you're looking at 16 games. In that sense, it's not a huge sample size always. The other things that we're able to see, one of the major questions that I had when it comes to, there not being exactly 12 quarterback ones, is where are the shortages and oversupplies at the positions. So that brings us down to here in the availability or scarcity, I like to call it, portion of the analysis. Tier 1, obviously there's going to be an undersupply with 2 quarterbacks that can offer 2 teams out of the 12, meaning an undersupply, an advantage over the league. This would be like if there was 6 quarterbacks who gave you an advantage, then I would just kind of call it neutral. Like tier 2, which has 13 total quarterbacks then that qualify as quarterback ones. The top 13 quarterbacks set themselves apart from the rest of the league, which means for a 12-team league that there is a slight oversupply of quarterback ones that are available. If you're not really losing anything on average with that 13th quarterback compared to the number 7 quarterback, well, on a week-to-week basis, there's no real telling the difference between them. And then there's an undersupply for 2 quarterback leagues here. There is an undersupply in total of starting quarterbacks for a 12-team 2 quarterback league. Other things that we can find out from these tiers and from all of this data come to these matrices that I am zooming past on the screen. And these are going to be looking at the types of advantages and disadvantages that each of the tiers have when pitting them against one another. And for each of these matrices, I'm going to go over how I looked at them through both the lens of tiers and the lens of the equalized value groups. So matrix 1.1 is looking at it through the equalized value group. And these are what I call like the scoring habits, or what percentage of weeks are quarterback 9s, so that'd be Josh Allen and Kyler Murray, scoring, giving you enough fantasy points that you would expect to have to be the quarterback 1 in any given week. 28% of weeks, those quarterbacks were giving you quarterback 1 output. Now the reason I word it like that is because, see these purple, well, in week 2, there's 3 quarterbacks that gave you enough points that in any given week, they could be the quarterback 1. So yes, right here you see week 6 has no quarterbacks. So that means, the quarterback 1 got less than you would expect most weeks. Pretty much every other week's going to have purple somewhere. There's 2 weeks that don't have anyone that gave you those kinds of numbers. That's how this data works. You can also see that if we go to Cloister 4, that's 10 points. Hold up. I passed it. You know what? Scratch that. So, anyways, that is how to look at these charts. You can also see that the quarterback 9, this is what I was looking for, will not give you a terrible week. I think this is about 10 points or less. I kind of know for a fact that that's probably what this is. And the other thing is, you can see that they're going to give you like a quarterback, a QB1, not the quarterback one on any given week, but a top 12 quarterback type of week just about every week except for maybe 21% of the weeks of the games. And it's interesting because that is going to play out in an example that we will look at where we're going to pull specific quarterbacks from each of those equalized value groupings here and pit them against each other. But we'll get to that soon. Just continuing on, here is the same information in the center, but you can see it's grouped together. And that was fun figuring that out. For the tiers. So tier 1 quarterbacks averaged 34% of the time that they would be in Cloister 1, which is really a top 3 quarterback. And I break all that information down into more edible kinds of consumable data that we will cover some of that in shortly. Looking at Matrix 2.1, once again, now we are going to be pitting the equalized value groups against each other to see what percentage of what kind of advantages they offer over each other on any given week, what you can expect there to be. So you would expect a quarterback 9 to give you like an 8% advantage over a QB 12. What does that mean, 8%? 1.82 points. Then, through a little bit of math, I also looked at probably the best number to look at here as far as just finding a quick value. 6.81 points is what you could expect against the field, against any given quarterback in any given week as an advantage if you were to have owned a Kyler Murray, have played a Josh Johnson, I think that's who it was, yeah, Josh Johnson, or owned Josh Allen last season. I think a lot of you would find that to have been quite true as far as an average goes. And the other thing to think about here, and why I do include the entire field in that portion at least, is that it takes awfully far down for you to get to quarterbacks that you weren't seen on, start sit, and on the start side of like start sit weekly articles in the fantasy season. I know for a fact Justin Fields got recommended plenty of the time. I know there's 1 or 2 weeks where Trevor Lawrence would have gotten a start recommendation. I played Jacoby Brissett a few weeks. We'll get to my quarterback issues last year. Yikes. And once again, Matrix 2.2 is just gathering, grouping that data up into tight little, our crystal ball here for tiers. And here I actually did break down for 1 quarterback leagues against the players, against the top 3 tiers that you are most likely going to see any given week, given the fact that most teams aren't having to dig into those start-sit types of decisions at the quarterback position most weeks. I'd say there's probably 4 teams that are thinking about taking somebody off of a waiver wire during the bye weeks. Other than that, there's like 1 or 2, hopefully none. And that is going to be that for that portion. Well, maybe I should... You can see by the time for a 1 quarterback league, by the time you get to a tier 3 quarterback, you are at a disadvantage, which falls in line with plenty of what I will talk about shortly. But you would be at an expected like 4-point, 3-point disadvantage in any given week against teams who have, the majority of teams who have a starting quarterback that they rely on. Something to just note here before I get into these draft day quick files, which you can start to take a peek at. is consistency. If you are someone who likes to use consistency ratings, like I have always really enjoyed Matthew Berry's consistency ratings, to maybe make slight alterations to like somebody else's pre-draft rankings that you're going to bring into your draft, and you like consistency ratings, so you go and maybe you highlight guys who are high up on the consistency, like Green, and guys who had terrible consistency, you give them a red highlight just so you know who you might prefer, even if they're ranked higher or lower than some other players nearby. If you're someone who likes those, let me start off by saying this is not going to be true of all the positions, but for the quarterback position, I've found several pieces of supporting evidence that I feel confident in saying that consistency is a predictor for success at the quarterback position. That being said, maybe be careful with 2 quarterback leagues. We'll get into that shortly. You'll see that. And the other 2 points I just want to make is that the EV chart is an excellent pre-made chart that you could look at, which rewards consistency. It does have the average fantasy points per week listed over onto the right-hand side. I'll show you that real quick. Over here. And what I like about that, I suppose, is sometimes you can see when players might be out of place for the average fantasy points overall based on using that might be out of place compared to the equalized value chart, which is not going to reward someone for having 1 great week and 3 bad weeks. That being said, there is an example that I wanted to look at here. I know it involves Tom Brady. So Tom Brady averaged the 2nd most fantasy points per week throughout the 2021 season. He is sitting here on my list as like the 3rd as far as quarterbacks that you might draft in 2022. So if you were to hear someone spouting out Tom Brady is the 2nd best quarterback of 2021 because he had the 2nd most average fantasy points scored, blah, blah, blah. And you're sitting there and you're like, but I like Kyler Murray. I just like him. I don't think I can trust Tom Brady. I don't like it. I don't know. Whatever your reasoning is. Well, guess what? Right here, my chart's saying that Kyler Murray is going to offer you a better chance to win on a weekly basis than Tom Brady anyways. So there you go. There's your sign. Go with your gut. Take Kyler Murray. Screw Tom Brady. I respect the guy. And one actually very specific to this, something to remember is that I did not take injuries out of this information. Sometimes that will skew guys, like there is a quarterback down here somewhere who played for Baltimore. Tyler Huntley. He had that 1 week where he ran like 10 yards to get some record for the Ravens versus Pittsburgh, which brought his average way down. Obviously, he had some pretty solid weeks. One really great. I thought he had like 2 of those purple weeks. But regardless, that obviously really hurt his outlook there. Just like this could have killed Kyler Murray's output if the rest of it wasn't so darn consistent and good. So he with his injury, he was still a little bit higher than Tom Brady according to my equalized value points system. The other thing, I do have consistency ratings available as well. I would call them in the beta stage, and maybe a little confusing. I have them set up by like top 48, top 36, top 24, set up in a few different pages. And because of how I did the rankings are relative to the sample size. So guys can move up or down and the overall, where they lie overall, based on the sample size, because it's normalized and then they're awarded points for that. And, one player who's really tanks the bottom, just I guess throws the normalization of that group of players out of whack compared to the next set of players, might really change the outputs that, the amount of points that a guy would get awarded in that category. Actually, so they're up on the website under analysis. I was clicking the right things. Quarterback consistency ratings. So you can see I have a few different sets of groups here, and so they get awarded points. And how the point system works is I normalize this, and then any quarterbacks that were within a certain percentage chance of the average fantasy points per week might get awarded 5 points, 3 points, 1 point, 7 points, and that can change from chart to chart because now I'm normalizing this data set, which is different than the previous data set. There, that's explained. Let's move on to the draft day quick files. This is if you want to bring something to the draft, or if you want to use something pre-draft to look at. Here's where I took what I think was the most relevant, most important, most top level, and with a combination of relevance information that you can bring to you on draft day. Looking at tier 1, we know 2 quarterbacks are expected to qualify within that. Oh god. And then let me lock this. The average expected fantasy points of a tier 1 quarterback is 20 plus points. You can expect at least 20 points every single week. 1 out of 3 weeks in 33% of the games, roughly 5 games a year, little more than that, you can expect 26 plus points from one of the top 2 quarterbacks of the draft. You don't have to worry about bad weeks for these guys. Under 10 points, not expected. Not going to happen. Then we're going to go down. Short-term chance at replacement is, I don't think anything I'll go over today. And then attack early or lay back on draft day. This just lets you know within this tier, do you want the guys at the top of the tier or the guys at the bottom of the tier based on their value? Some of those, like that value mountain, pretty directly based off of that. And here it's saying attack. So you do want the Josh Allen. You don't necessarily want the Kyler Murray if, putting draft capital pretty evenly. But of course, this is not taking draft capital into the equation. So that is something that we'll get to as we look into turning all this into combining all of the positions together to look at, compare them to see how they stack up against each other. Looking at the tier 2 quarterbacks, the rest of the starting level quarterbacks, you're expecting to get 16 or more fantasy points in any given week. You're still expecting 26 plus fantasy points in 25% of the games. That's really only one less game than tier 1, so that's not bad. However, there is also a 10% chance that you're going to get under 10 points. That's 1 or 2 games. Not terrible either. They're pretty strong, a pretty strong second tier, but there is a difference from the first tier to the second tier. And of course, there's going to be some differences, in the 2021 players from the top to the bottom, but we're trying to figure out our 2022 draft, and we can pinpoint which players we think will do better within that on our own by individually looking at other factors. As far as the tier 2 players, I wrote that it's complicated. Technically, things say to lay back and just get a quarterback within this area of the draft that comes to you. Don't push the issue. The thing is, you should push the issue as far as getting one of them. You don't want a tier 3 quarterback, especially in a single quarterback league. Looking at the third tier, here's where you're going to see why this third tier is what it is. You're expecting 12 to 16 points every single week. You will get more some weeks. In fact, in 20% of the games, you'll get 20 plus fantasy points. That is 3 to 4 games out of the season. Also, you can expect in the same amount of games to get less than 10 fantasy points. And the general consensus, the general strategy, once you're into this tier of quarterbacks, would be to lay back. you can let a few of these guys get drafted before you really need to push the issue. But don't push it too far because you don't want to be down here. Look at some of those differences on your own. That just kind of gives you a baseline information on some of the things that I found during the analysis. But now let's wrap up the video, begin to wrap it up by going over some of the interesting nuggets that I found along the way. And that's going to bring us right down to the bottom of this for, I believe, an example of some bonus analysis that I did, which bonus analysis really just means that I didn't do that type. The analysis, the idea of it came out of some question that I wanted an answer to while doing this specific position. It's not going to be something that I necessarily did for every position, whereas all of these sections are going to be consistent, funny, through each position. Here we are. So I told you earlier I took one of these quarterbacks from each of the EV, equalized value groupings of quarterbacks. So the quarterback 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24. No quarterbacks averaged worse than the quarterback 24 according to that data. As far as quarterbacks that are starting level quarterbacks that played more than 5 weeks, so 6 or more weeks on the season. And I patted them against each other each and every week and found out how many wins they had on average, how many losses they had, what was their win rate against. I did more analysis than what is here, but what is here is interesting. While doing this specific bonus analysis on consistency, as you may have noticed in the matrices, even the worst quarterbacks showed the ability to be a top 3 quarterback in any given week, which brought up the question for me that I'm trying to answer is the elite season-long upside for the top few quarterbacks? Is that something that's legitimate? Is it bankable? Could you put collateral down on it and the bank would accept that collateral? Would the bank accept them as collateral? Are they worth being elite? Are they elite on a weekly basis? Can you expect that? And part of the proof to that answer, the answer is yes. And I think for most positions it is yes. Part of the proof is right here in this example where we see that Josh Allen, the number 1 quarterback of the 2021 season, by whatever measure you want to use, averaged 12 wins and 3 losses against Matt Stafford, Joe Burrow, Derek Carr, Matt Ryan, Trevor Lawrence. That's how this set of data worked. For a win rate of 77%. Matt Stafford, a tier 2, which is a QB 12 on average, he averaged 10 wins and 5 losses for a win rate of 68%. And I will mention right now that I did not choose these players by random. So Matt Stafford and Joe Burrow, both being from tier 2, mostly is for one very specific reason that's in here, but ultimately Matt Stafford was like the king of consistency, and Joe Burrow would be the king of boom or bust in 2021. So I really wanted to see how those two compared for each other, and it's actually a little bit more interesting than that, but not so much more interesting that that's worth going over. Derek Carr I chose pretty much because he's middle of the line for a tier 3 to just give me someone right in the middle there. Matt Ryan, kind of similar, is in the middle of a QB 21 type rating, I think. For tier 4, I also wanted to look at the QB 21s versus the QB 24s based on something else that I observed in the data. In the analysis, really, of the data. And then Trevor Lawrence was the worst quarterback of 2022 as far as starting 2021. As far as starting quarterbacks go, based on the EV charts, I don't know, maybe he wasn't quite, but he averaged, we don't need to go there yet, but that's why he's in there, to see how low the bar goes and how the lowest bar compares to all the other higher bars. Back up to Matt Stafford, who averaged 10 wins, 5 losses for a win rate of 68%. Pretty solid, 2 out of 3 weeks you're expecting to win. Joe Burrow averaged 8 wins and 7 losses for a win rate of 56%. They are in the same tier for reasons, and let's look at a few things that I noted about these two. Stafford and Stafford are back-to-back on the EV chart, and just in case you have a keen eye, you will see they are not back-to-back on this chart, because what I was looking at when I did that was one without Gardner Minshew, Taysom Hill, Joe Flacco, Cooper Rush, guys who started less than 5 weeks. So they're back-to-back amongst starters. And then that gets into a little bit something else. So they are right there, neck and neck with each other. Versus each other, Stafford cleaned up, and he won 11 of the 15 matchups facing head-to-head. Versus the third tier, Derek Carr, Stafford won 2 more games than Burrow won. Versus the fourth tier, they did the same. Despite being pummeled in the wins-loss category, right here if you're following along, versus Stafford, so talking about Burrow here, who had 4 games, remember, out of those 15 games won, Burrow still managed to net a positive in the fantasy points differential between the two. He scored 0.2 more fantasy points over Stafford amongst those 15 games where he only won 4 of them, which is pretty insane. But that just shows you how close all of those wins were for Stafford, because he's the king of consistency, remember, and how much of a difference that made on the season-long level, where Joe Burrow just, got you that big win that one week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, or 4 weeks, whatever the exact case may be. Either way, so you're seeing these two guys in this tier. They're providing different types of value for your team. Some teams need that boom bust. They have consistency elsewhere. They just have a lot of guys that are boom or bust, and it just comes down to 3 of them clicking in 1 week, and it's a victory every time. Moving along to the third tier guy, Derek Carr, a member of the underappreciated crew, truly, for the position. And he had 6 wins and 9 losses for a win rate of 41%. Not excellent. But he did perform just as well as Tier 1 against Tier 1 as he did versus Tier 2. Yeah, I said that correctly. He went 4-11 against both tiers, and his nemesis was Joe Burrow, who he went 3-12 against, so obviously that means he went 5-10 against Stafford. But that means that the Tier 3 guys will give you a 25% shot at the big dogs. And they had about a 66% win rate versus the lower rated guys, which brings you to the Heinekes, the Geno Smiths, the guys, the Ben Roethlisbergers, Tyler Huntley, well, not really, Sam Darnold's. So some of those guys who you might see like 3 weeks out of the year, a 66% win rate against them, so not too shabby. All again, and big vision of things, especially for 2 quarterback leagues. But versus the field, he did average negative 2.3 fantasy points overall, which lines up. Oh, I should have brought something else. So that lines up very closely with the Matrix. Negative 2.3, negative 3.1, negative 9 versus the field, right in that range. Or even better, look up here, quarterback, was he 21? Negative 2.74. And the other thing was earlier, I mentioned we would talk about this 21% rate where he's having like iffy games. Speaking of the Tier 1 quarterbacks. And what was that win rate again for Josh Allen? Oh, 77%. That's within just 2 percentage points of the other score. And the fan has turned on. Hopefully that's not too loud. Moving on to Tier 4, Matt Ryan, Trevor Lawrence. Matt Ryan averaged 5 wins, 10 losses for a win rate of 36%. Not looking too good, but not a heck of a lot worse than Derek Carr. And Trevor Lawrence, the worst quarterback, averaged 3 wins and 12 losses against the rest of the field for a win rate of 21%, which, 1 in 5 games won for the worst quarterback is better than I would have expected coming into looking at this analysis. And Matty Ice won 9 and lost 6 when pitting these two against each other. So you can see that within the 4th tier, there is some gold to be had right near the top when comparing them to bottom tier. Matt is the less consistent guy of the two. Remember, I told you consistency is a key predictor to success for the position until you get to the bad quarterbacks, because what is consistently doing bad how's that gonna help you? So if you are looking for a quarterback to help you, that bye week, 2 weeks while your quarterback's injured, don't go with the guy who's getting you 10 to 12 points, who's scoring 10 to 12 points every single week. Go for the upside. It's worth it, because look at this. Versus the field, Matty Ice, he averaged negative 3.8 fantasy points. Not great, but when you compare that to Trevor Lawrence, who averaged negative 7.2 fantasy points in any given week, you might want those 4 fantasy points. Might make a difference. Something else that I wanted to point out from this portion of the analysis, specifically for 2 quarterback leagues in this data, was that, and you can see it in this data in the matrices, was that Josh Allen's victories outweighed Trevor Lawrence's losses. This is what I was looking for earlier, with a different example. There's your difference. So Josh Allen had a positive 8.3 points on average per week against the field, and vice versa, Trevor Lawrence, negative 7.2 points versus the field. And what does this mean? In a 2 quarterback league, that you could draft the number 1 quarterback on the season and then wait and end up with the worst quarterback. Obviously, you don't want to aim for the worst quarterback, but get the worst quarterback on the season, and more weeks than not, you would still end up beating your opponent's 2 quarterbacks. That's a fact. It's a pretty cool one. The same cannot be said for having a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 quarterback along with a Tier 4 quarterback. It's just going to be a net loss at that point. And in fact, it may not hold true if you were to team up a Tier 2 and a Tier 3 quarterback. At that point, I don't remember exactly why it may not be true. I think it was either true or not, depending on looking at the stats directly, but then manually looking at something else, I would have determined that it's more of a 50-50 type situation, probably. Depends which 2 you get. So, for 2 quarterback leagues, if you do not draft one of these studs, make sure to get 2 of the top 15-ish quarterbacks off the board. Otherwise, you are going to be in a hole at the position for the season. Doesn't mean you're going to lose every single week against your opponent's 2 quarterbacks, but you're in a hole. Bye. Sticking with 2 quarterback leagues, other observations that I made were: number 1, with the worst starting quarterbacks still averaging the quarterback 24 type of numbers, none of them are expected to be complete horse crap. And outside of pure potential, what I mean by that is like a rookie quarterback who may earn a starting role a few weeks into the season, that type of situation, there should be little to no urgency to draft the very next best quarterback off of the board after roughly the top 17 quarterbacks have been taken. Roughly. in general, number 2 here, in general, quarterback replacement is not tough across the board for 2 quarterback leagues across the board, as I said. But why I'm stammering a little bit is it's tough to get quarterbacks after the draft, even within the draft, I believe, in 2 quarterback leagues. There's not a whole lot of extra quarterbacks to fill out rosters. But what it means is any given quarterback should be a sufficient quarterback to replace most likely who you might have on your roster, and you might be surprised. You might get a Josh Johnson or a Tyler Huntley from last season. There's a lot of guys who you probably weren't excited to be throwing out there the week that you did, and then, hey, you got a really good week out of them. Maybe a literal quarterback number 1 week. Bit of an overheating problem there if you notice movement of where I am just suddenly in the video. I don't recall exactly where I left off, and I don't know exactly where it cut off. I think I was just looking at it weirdly, waiting for it to shut off. Probably keep that in there. So,
how you doing? I'm a geek with the YouTube channel, and I like to talk about camera gear, filmmaking.
Had to look up how to fix that overheating issue. I don't remember exactly where I got cut off there, but the essential thing, I know we were talking about quarterback replacements, and the idea is that you can stitch together, if you are cheap with your quarterback number 2, I think that's right where I was, then it is not out of the realm of possibility for you to stitch together even better value than, that 23rd, 24th quarterback that you ended up getting in the draft from short-term replacement options. Getting those actual replacement options when they pop up might be a little bit tougher done than said, but if as long as you can get somebody out there, you should probably be okay in replacing that back-end value for sure. You may find yourself a better long-term starter along the way, and that is what's going to lead to this bit of advice in this event. In the event that you take a late quarterback who doesn't just come out of the gate, awesome for you, you got a great value, sweet. You should be aggressive in-season acquisitions of pretty much all quarterback options that come along. Maybe just keep a 3rd spot on your roster to happen across somebody who pops off, but especially in the event of a long-term injury that happens to someone, go out, make sure you get that replacement quarterback, because you might just be able to totally vamp up that quarterback 2 spot on your starting roster. Somewhat relevant to that, but also transitioning into single quarterback leagues, is just the health of the position. There is a 56% chance that a quarterback starts for 15 or 16 weeks across the season. That means 1 bye week and then 1 or 2 weeks that they are injured, that you would not have them to be starting for you. That's not shabby. That said, I would argue that it's even a little bit of a higher chance just by looking at some of the players who would have tanked that percentage down a good little bit. If you have a starting quarterback, a guy there's no competition on the roster type of player, then you're looking at better than 60% odds. Maybe 2 out of 3 of them, you're going to get 15 to 16 games started out of them. Typically, quarterback injuries only last 1 or 2 weeks, and that's why I say that. That is the standard. So now let's move on to these single quarterback leagues. After the elite quarterbacks, it is less and less urgent for you to go and get the very next best quarterback off the board. Now, that's a bit of a double-edged sword. That also means that maybe you kind of want the next best quarterback because it's getting less urgent. That's a bit of a personal choice where you want to draw that line. I will have a sweet spot for you in just a moment, but just so you know, that trend of it being less and less urgent to get the very next best quarterback off the board continues past the amount of quarterbacks that you would expect to be taken in most 12-team single quarterback leagues. Here's where that sweet spot is that I would recommend aiming for. Given the relative amount of accuracy that pre-draft rankings for quarterbacks have across the industry, pretty good at getting those the position ranked fairly decently. Given that fact, the sweet spot is going to be between quarterbacks 9 to 15 roughly. And some of the names that landed in that sweet spot in 2021 were like Justin Herbert, Tom Brady, Matt Stafford, Jalen Hurts. I keep feeling like I'm saying his name wrong when I say Jalen Hurts. And Burrow. Herbert was actually the number 8th in ADP in 2021. And that's going to bring me to two little side points that I have here. The first being that the numbers that I'm providing you are not exact. These are... look through the analysis, you'll see why. But I mean, obviously we can't predict the future with 100% accuracy. I can't say exactly this many quarterbacks that. So the best practice is to use them as guidelines. So when I say quarterback 9 to 15, don't let the 8th quarterback get taken for no other reason than, oh, well, I remember that one guy, he said to get the 9th quarterback off the board, not the 8th. Well, there goes Justin Herbert, and maybe you're not getting a Brady, Stafford, Hurts, or Burrow with whoever you take at that 9th spot in that example. Whatever the case, guidelines. And similarly, not all experts create their tiers the same or with the same ideologies behind how they created those tiers. There's so many different ways you can break them down. For instance, even my tiers, I'm going to use this as a guideline. I'm going to do them differently than I've done in the past, just to kind of figure out rough numbers of players that I'm going to have in my tiers is what the guideline that I'm going to use this mostly for. And I'm still going to end up having sub-tiers because I love to have these little sub-tiers of players that I expect have the best potential to outperform where the tier that I had them ranked in previously. So usually I start out with my main tiers, and then once I like guys for some specific reason, I'll bump them up into this little sub-tier. So that way they stand out to me, if nothing else. I had both of the Rams wide receivers last year in one of those types of categories. I thought, hey, one of these guys is going to be a top 10 wide receiver. I never expected the season that Cooper Kupp had, but I also expected Robert Woods to be healthy for a whole season. Who knows how that second half of the year would have looked, but to be honest, Kupp looked better with Robert Woods on the field. So maybe he would have even had a better season. Either way, that's how I like to make my tiers. And not everybody else does it the same way. So, once again, when I say tier 1, tier 2, don't go applying that directly to somebody else's tier system. They might have 8 tiers and might have 4, like it do for the quarterbacks. Which, once again, is why I provided the numbers too. So you can maybe equate those roughly to somebody else's tiers if you wish to. Last up for the single quarterback leagues is that in case of an injury, there is a 33% chance of you finding a similar quality replacement. 1 in 3, not great, not the worst. So I don't make a distinction for the elite quarterbacks here because of those quarterbacks that are going to qualify in that 33% chance. They also give you a good enough chance of giving you that elite top 3 type output, top 4, I think it is literally, top 4 game in any given week at a high enough percentage of their games, of their replacement games that they're coming in, that I don't think that distinction needs to be made. You know, maybe it's 10% less chance, but ultimately in season you can see who the opponent is, make some little slightly better, hopefully, educated work on who to use for any week. In conclusion, for the quarterback position, there is an elite upside worthy of targeting on draft day. Once that is gone, once the elite 2, 3-ish guys are gone, there is no need to prioritize the position. Just be sure not to miss out on those top 15, 16, maybe 17 type guys. That 9 through 15 spot's really where you want to be. Don't be drafting into quarterback 20. You just want to start to avoid those types of guys. If you do miss out on those guys, though, the top 15, 16-ish, odds are that you will be streaming the position and searching for a very elusive long-term solution to your whoever it is that you drafted. So I do want to say it is viable to stream the position, but it's just not something that should be necessary given the amount of draft capital that you have to spend on the 15th quarterback of the draft. It's not very high. And trust me, from a horrible quarterback experience last year, this truly is the case. I bucked the odds in the wrong direction, but still kind of followed the odds with having several weeks that were still 20 plus points. But ultimately, it really, really tanked my season a lot of weeks by doing a horrible job with the guys that I was choosing to stream. And it's not like I was going off, and streaming Joe Schmo every week. It was just bad luck. And that's part of this game. That's part of why this analysis takes those kinds of things into consideration. So you just don't want to be in that position. If I had just spent the draft capital to get a Jalen Hurts, which is one of the guys that I liked in that area of the draft, I liked how late he was being taken compared to where I valued him. But I also had someone who was just basically going undrafted that I really liked, who got injured, like, I don't know, the third play or something of the season, or after a quarter of play, whatever the case. If I wouldn't have been giving up much. I wouldn't have lost much from whoever I drafted in that, like, 8th round-ish area, I believe, to get Jalen Hurts on my team, and I would have had a much better roster season long. I want to thank you very much for watching, for supporting the channel. I should have another video on a different position, kickers and defenses, next. I'm going to just put them in one video coming out in this series. Roughly every other day or so is the target goal. Now, I've had learning a lot as I go along here, technical issues, but it looks like I have everything going up, and I know the process here. So once we're done with all of the positions, I will collect all of that data, compare all the positions together, and just kind of get a general draft profile and where the values of positions, after the first tier of this position, then this tier kicks in. Somewhere in that tier, you can start to look at the wide receivers, whatever the case, however that works out. I'll bring it all together in a video, and then I will release my 2022 draft rankings, and finally we'll start mocking it up. So, thank you for your support. Steve out.